The first thing I noticed was the boots. They were wet, heavy-looking, parked neatly side by side on the rubber mat outside room 3B. But the thing that really caught me, was that they were bone dry around the soles. And it had been snowing hard for the past 3 hours. No melting trail, no slush, not even a single footprint leading to or from the door. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the door clicked shut, softly, as if someone had been watching me the whole time. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel quite right. And if these stories help pass the long nights, feel free to subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, working as a front desk clerk at a mid-range ski lodge up near Nederland, Colorado. This was back in 2006. Winter came early that year, heavy and mean. Most folks think of Colorado snow as picturesque, but once the tourists leave and the storm warnings start rolling in, it's a different thing entirely. The lodge didn't see a lot of traffic in January. A few pass-through truckers, couples trying to save money after the holidays, and the occasional quiet guest who wanted to be left alone. I worked evenings, usually 300 p.m. to 1100 p.m. Then Len Turner, our overnight maintenance guy, would take over. Len was one of those men who spoke slow and didn't fill silences unless he had to. He'd worked the lodge for over a decade and didn't spook easy. That's probably why I told him first. The storm had rolled in around 5. Thick, wet flakes blowing sideways, icing up the front windows in long, horizontal streaks. We'd only had 2 check-ins that evening, and both had already turned in early. Just before my shift ended around 10:40, someone came through the lobby doors without ringing the bell. I looked up from behind the desk and saw him, maybe mid-50s, wearing an old green parka that looked like it had belonged to someone else first. He didn't speak, didn't even take his hood down. Just walked up to the counter, pulled out a leather billfold, and slid over a wad of 20s. He had no reservation, no luggage, just that parka and a dull black duffel that looked about 10 years past new. I tried to keep my voice neutral. Looking for a room tonight. He didn't answer, just tapped the money once with his gloved fingers. I asked for ID. He shook his head once, not rude, more like someone who'd already made peace with not giving it. It wasn't technically allowed, but the roads were nearly shut, and the wind was hitting a mean pitch. I slid over the registration clipboard, but he didn't write anything. Just picked up the room key and turned toward the hallway without a word. Room 3B. I noted it mentally. Left side end of the west corridor, quiet and far from the other guests. Len arrived a few minutes later, and I told him about the man. He didn't react much, just shrugged and said, "We get all kinds in weather like this." Still, I remember the look he gave the key rack, like he was already memorizing which room the guy was in. I clocked out and headed home. My cabin was just a few minutes away, but the storm made it feel longer. I don't know why, but I kept thinking about the man's eyes, what little I could see of them, under the shadow of his hood. Not wild, not angry, just too still, like someone holding their breath underwater. The next day, I came in around 3:15 and checked the log. No calls from 3B, no complaints. Len was sipping his usual vending machine coffee and nodded when I asked him. Didn't see him all night, he said. He didn't come out for breakfast either. That wasn't unusual. We had guests who slept through until checkout all the time. But something about that felt off. I walked the corridor mid-shift, partly out of habit, partly to check the heaters. Room 3B's door was shut, no light under the frame, but those same boots were outside again. Same position, same strange, dry soles. That evening around 6 Huzres, I finally knocked, lightly, just once. No answer. I knocked again, then leaned in. Housekeeping, I said, though we didn't offer it past noon. Still nothing. I left it alone. We weren't the kind of place that disturbed sleeping guests. That night I left a small note, just a card that said, "Let us know if you need anything," and tucked it under the door. The next morning, Len told me it was gone when he did his rounds at 4:00 a.m. But the boots were still there. The third night, something changed. Around 2:47 a.m., the phone at the front desk rang. Len picked it up expecting a weather report or a call from dispatch, but it was just silence. He said he could hear breathing, not loud, just slow and steady, like someone was holding the receiver just far enough from their mouth to be heard. After a while, the line clicked off. He walked the hall after that, shined his flashlight through the little security pane in each door. Room 3B was dark. Still no sound. Still no footprints in or out. The boots were still there. The next day, I checked the system. No calls had been placed from that room. No long-distance charges. Nothing. The line was listed as inactive. By the 5th night, the other guests had checked out. We were empty except for him. And yet we never saw him again. Len tried knocking once firmly this time. Still nothing. When checkout came and went the next morning, I waited until noon and finally used the spare key. I expected the room to be empty. I wasn't prepared for what I found. Everything was in perfect order. The bed hadn't been touched. The blinds were drawn. The sink was dry. The TV remote still wrapped in the little paper sleeve we always left it in. But the heat was turned off. And on the desk was a piece of paper, not our notepad, not anything from the lodge, just a single sheet torn from a composition book. It had one thing written on it. A time. 2:47 a.m. That was it. Len and I stood there for a long time. We checked the logs. No new footprints outside. No door alarms triggered. And yet the boots were gone. We never saw the man leave. No checkout. No credit card. No name. Just the cash and the silence and that note. We eventually had to mark the room as vacant. But neither of us ever assigned 3B again unless the place was full. It stayed quiet most of the time, but every now and then the front desk phone rings once around 2:47 a.m. and then stops. No caller ID, no voice, just the same breath right at the edge of hearing. That was the year I stopped working nights. Len stayed on a few more seasons. He still won't talk about that room. And to this day, I can still picture the way those boots looked. Dry soles, facing the wrong way, as if someone had walked out backward. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those stories that sounds like a lie, even while you're saying it, the kind people smile politely at before changing the subject. But I remember every detail. I remember the shape of the frost on the inside of the window. I remember the sound the truck made as it pulled in, not loud, not broken, just wrong, like something that hadn't moved in a long, long time. In 2015, I was 21 and living in Tok, Alaska. I was going to school part-time and working nights at a remote fuel stop about 20 miles north mile 237. It was one of those skeleton crew stations with just a single pump, a tired little service shop, and an office the size of a motel room. There wasn't much business after midnight, especially in winter. The place was half buried in snow from November through March, and most of the truckers knew better than to take that stretch of road in bad weather. I didn't mind the solitude. My supervisor, Marlene, always said the real trouble came from the living, not the dead. She meant that as a joke. I used to laugh along. Now I'm not so sure. The first time the truck came, it was around 2:05 in the morning on a Wednesday. That detail stuck with me because the shift had been dead quiet, and I remember checking the wall clock right before the headlights hit the window. The truck was old mid-1980s blue Chevy pickup, beat up, but not rusty. It pulled up to pump 4, which was closest to the station doors, and sat there. Engine running, headlights still on. I gave it a minute or two before heading out to offer a receipt or check on the pump. That was standard protocol. But when I stepped outside, I realized no one had gotten out. The driver's side window was up, and behind the glass, I could just barely make out the shape of a man sitting behind the wheel. He wasn't moving, not even a head turn when I approached. I tapped the glass just lightly. Nothing. No flinch, no acknowledgement. I started to get at what? That cold under-the-skin feeling, the one you get when something feels off, but you don't know why yet. I looked down at the pump. It hadn't started. No fuel had been dispensed. The hose was still resting in its cradle. I took a slow step back, then another, and by the time I turned toward the office, the engine idled once, then stopped. Inside, I watched through the security monitor. The truck stayed parked another 5 minutes. Then it pulled out slowly, never using the lights, and disappeared into the snow like it had never been there at all. I didn't mention it to Marlene when I logged my report. I figured maybe the driver had fallen asleep or gotten spooked by the wind. You tell enough stories like that and they lose their shape, so I let it go. At least I tried to. A week later, on another Wednesday, it came back. Same time, same truck, same pump. I didn't go out this time. I watched from the office, back of my neck prickling with that same strange tension. The man behind the wheel didn't move. He just sat there. When I looked at the monitor, the timestamp read 2:04. Then the screen glitched just for a split second. A flicker. The kind of interference you get with old tape. We were digital. The lights in the ceiling dimmed slightly. The room felt colder, though I hadn't touched the thermostat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And when I looked up again, the truck was gone. No tire tracks, no noise, just gone. This time, I wrote it down. Just a quick note in the logbook. Blue pickup, pump 4, approx 2:05 a.m. No driver exit, no fuel. I didn't say anything else, but 2 nights later, Marlene called in on the radio to check schedules, and I asked if she'd ever seen anything weird on night shift. There was a pause too long for a static delay. Then she said, "Pump 4." I said yes. She didn't answer right away. Then she told me not to worry, said the cameras sometimes acted up in cold weather, and asked if I'd remembered to salt the east lot. But I knew she'd seen something or heard something. She just didn't want to say it. The third visit was when I stopped pretending it was anything normal. That Wednesday, I was already waiting by the office door by 1:50 gloves on watching the road. Snow was falling, but light this time. Around 2:02, the headlights appeared. Same truck, same sound. It pulled in, eased into place at pump 4 and stopped. The engine kept running. And again, no one got out. I stood at the window and watched. The front windshield looked fogged over, but not from the inside. The glass was streaked like something had been pressing against it, dragging downward, but from the outside. That was the part I couldn't explain. It looked like frost had melted and refrozen, except the patterns didn't make sense. Long smears, parallel like fingers. Then I saw something else. In the faint reflection from the glass, I could just barely make out movement inside the office, not behind me, in front of me, like a shadow cast from the wrong direction. I turned fast, but nothing was there. Still, I backed away slowly. Didn't turn my back to the window. Didn't touch the door. The truck sat for 3 more minutes. Then the engine cut out. No tail lights, no sound, just gone. I checked the cameras after. The footage skipped from 2:03 to 2:06. No recording in between. I checked the logbook, flipped back a few pages. I don't know what made me do it, but I started looking at old weather reports and visitor logs. In January 1992, a man named Walter Hricks went missing up near mile 240. He'd been a winter laborer working a mining contract, last seen driving a blue Chevy pickup. His case was still listed as unresolved. The file said the last place his time card was punched was a fuel stop somewhere near 237. Our station had no records that old. Over the next few weeks, I tried to ignore it, but every stormy Wednesday, the truck came back, never early, never late. 2:04 a.m. every time. I stopped going outside. I stopped writing it down. But the weird part, the part that still knots my stomach, is that it wasn't just the truck. On the 6th visit, I started seeing other things, not outside. Inside the station, in the reflection of the window, in the frost on the cooler doors. Shapes, faint outlines of people, faces, staring, always in the reflection, never when I turned to look directly. And the names on the logbook pages, some of them began to change. I swear I didn't write them. Names of guests who were never on my shift, names I didn't recognize. In handwriting that wasn't mine. I worked that job until March. Then I quit. No final paycheck. No 2-week notice. I left my last shift early just after 2:00 a.m. Left the logbook, open keys in the drawer, and never went back. Sometimes I still check road cameras for that area. Once or twice, I thought I saw it, that shape, frozen in the corner of a still frame. Too dark to be sure. But every time I think about it, I remember what Marlene said when I asked her a second time after I'd turned in my badge. "Pump 4, she'd said. "Yeah, it happens. You're not the first." Then she added one last thing, almost too quietly to catch. "But you're the first who stayed past week 3. The last real trip I took with my dad was the kind of thing I should have remembered fondly. Just the two of us back in the Alaska wilds like we used to when I was a kid. But the only thing I think about now is the silence. The long, unnatural stretches of stillness between sounds, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something we never saw. It was late September 2017, and I was 28. I'd grown up in Valdez and worked in a shop down near Glen Allen, mostly on diesel rigs and snow machines. My dad, Don, had just retired from the Department of Natural Resources, and I think he was struggling a bit with the shift. The kind of guy who didn't know what to do with himself unless he was out tracking something. When he asked if I wanted to do a father-son moose hunt up in the Copper River Basin, I said yes before he even finished asking. We'd done it when I was younger, flown in, camped a few nights, packed light but smart. It was supposed to be one of those simple, grounding trips. We flew out on a Monday morning in a 2-seater float plane. Our pilot dropped us just off a glacial tributary, where my dad had hunted a few times over the years. There was a little gravel bar to set up on, and just enough tree cover to block the wind. The weather was fair, maybe mid-40s during the day, low 30s at night. Clear air, no bugs. It should have been perfect. But from the first night, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way the tree line looked too still, the way the fire seemed to burn quieter than usual. My dad didn't say anything, and I figured maybe it was just my nerves. It had been a long time since I'd slept outside. The second morning we started following sign up along the ridge. No tracks, no scat, nothing. That wasn't totally unheard of. Moose can vanish into timber faster than you'd expect, but it was odd. Dad kept checking his GPS, muttering that we should have seen more movement by now. By early afternoon, we stumbled onto something that neither of us could explain. A carcass. Not moose, a snowshoe hare laid out in the open near a patch of low brush. It had been killed recently. The blood hadn't even darkened yet, but it wasn't torn apart like you'd see with a fox or an eagle. It was split clean down the middle. No entrails dragged, no obvious bite marks, just laid open like something had cut it and set it down for us to find. My dad crouched over it for a long time without speaking. Eventually, he just said, "Too clean," and stood up. We kept walking. An hour later, we found a second animal, this time a ptarmigan. Same thing, no struggle, no feathers scattered, just dead cleanly. I asked my dad if it could be a trapper in the area, but he shook his head. Trappers take what they kill. That night, the temperature dropped fast. We stayed close to the fire and barely talked. I noticed my dad kept his rifle closer than usual, resting it across his lap while we ate. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly and realized there was no sound at all. Not even wind, no rustling trees, no distant water. Just stillness so complete it made my ears ring. I sat up and looked through the mesh of the tent flap. My dad was already awake, sitting on a stump just outside the fire ring. He was staring toward the tree line like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I almost called out, but something about the way he was sitting made me stop, like he didn't want to be seen. The next day we hiked farther out, still no game. But we found more signs. Another hare, a fox, a small owl, its wings neatly folded, placed upright on a rock like someone had positioned it that way. No blood this time, no visible wounds, just eyes open, frozen mid-blink. My dad finally admitted it wasn't right. He said he'd been hunting that region since the late 80s and had never seen a kill pattern like this. It wasn't predation. It wasn't even territorial. It was intentional, like something was setting these out. We decided to break camp early and head back to the drop point. The pilot wasn't scheduled to return for 2 more days, but there was a satellite beacon in our gear if we needed an early pickup. That night, while we packed quietly by headlamp, We heard the first actual sound we'd heard in days. A single low howl, not near, not far, not canine either. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a bear. It didn't even carry right. It sounded almost mechanical, like something trying to imitate a howl and not quite getting it right. I looked at my dad. He didn't look confused. He looked scared. That scared me more than anything. We didn't sleep that night. Around 3 a.m., I caught something moving out in the trees. Just a glimpse, a shape between the branches. Too tall for a moose, too smooth for a bear. We never saw it directly, but we knew it was there, watching. Just before dawn, we activated the beacon. The pilot came early afternoon. As we loaded our gear, I asked if anyone else had been dropped nearby. He said no, not for miles. He offered us a weird smile and said, "Game's been quiet this season. You boys get anything?" My dad just said no and climbed in. We never went back. A year later, I asked him if he ever told anyone at DNR about what we saw or didn't see. He said no. He didn't want it written down anywhere. What I remember most isn't the thing in the woods or the way the owl looked. It's that eerie quiet, the kind that feels full like something's holding its breath just behind the tree line. And the kills precise, almost surgical, like something out there was watching us studying how we hunted and trying to do the same. Whatever it wasn't hunting for food. I used to think GPS collars were foolproof, not perfect. Sure, batteries die, terrain interferes, but if something went wrong, you could always at least find a signal trail. But that fall up near the border, we lost 43 of them in a single night. Not a slow taper, not a scattering over a week, just gone all of them at once. And what still keeps me up is what we saw on the thermal footage the morning after. In 2019, I was part of a research team out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, studying caribou migration near the 40-mile river basin. I was 30 at the time, mostly doing field work and data maintenance. We had a seasonal camp set up about 30 miles off the Taylor Highway, backed up against miles of old spruce and willow scrub. It was remote, but not extreme. By Alaska standards, a handful of cabins, generators, a rough satellite link. We'd collared just over 60 animals. For that season's study, and every morning I'd check the tag activity and plot movement clusters. Most of our days were uneventful. Long hours of watching pings inch across the screen. Then a few days of travel to retrieve data from camera traps. Calvin, our tech, stayed up late with the drones and Dr. R. Ray mostly kept to himself, holed up in the comms trailer checking atmospheric pressure or filling out grant reports. We weren't close, but we worked well enough together. The kind of team that didn't talk much at breakfast, which was fine by me. One morning in late September, I came into the data trailer just after 6. The temperature had dropped hard overnight. We'd had frost on the tent flaps and the battery inverter kicked twice before it stabilized. I pulled up the tracker panel and at first I thought the system had crashed. All the active collar icons, 43 of them, were missing from the screen. Not grayed out, not blinking, just gone. I refreshed the software thinking it had frozen. Still nothing. Calvin was in the seat next to me by then, staring over my shoulder. I pulled up the raw data stream, thinking maybe we were reading it wrong, but the log showed the last transmission from every missing collar hit at 2:47 a.m., down to the second. Then silence. We checked the drone footage next. Calvin had set up a patrol path over one of the high-density corridors west of our camp. That's where most of the herd had been moving the day before. The thermal camera wasn't perfect, but it gave us enough to work with. The footage started normal streaks of warm movement across cold earth, a few defined animals, a couple slower ones off to the edges. Then right around the 2:47 mark, something new appeared. 7 figures. That's what Calvin called them. Figures. Not animals, not shapes. Figures. They were upright. That was the first thing I noticed. They didn't move like people, not quite. Too smooth, too fast. They glided almost. Same pace, same angle, same spacing. Like a choreographed movement. No variation, no hesitation. Just this eerie, perfect symmetry. They moved through the herd, or maybe around it, and the collars dropped off the feed line one by one, like candles being blown out in a line. No audio, just silent heat trails and the static hum of the drone's readout. Then the footage cut out for a full 12 seconds. When it resumed, the field was empty. No caribou, no movement, no trace. We didn't know what to do with that. We didn't even talk, just sat there, watching the playback over and over. Dr. Ray came in about 20 minutes later and didn't say much either, just asked if we had the backup flight logs and then left the trailer. That afternoon, we took the rover up to the last known cluster point near the northern ridgeline, where several collars had last pinged. The drive took about an hour, and we didn't speak much on the way. Calvin had the drone set up again this time, flying manually from the ridge. I walked the perimeter checking for scat or tracks, any sign of a herd. We found nothing, no tracks, no fur, no droppings. It was like they'd never been there. Except for one thing. About 100 yards east of the cluster center, right near the tree break, we found a set of boots. Our boots, the kind we issued for field surveys. The rubber kind, black with the orange trim. But they weren't lying in a pile, like someone took them off. They were placed heel to toe, pointed straight toward the tree line. We radioed in to check who had gone out that way last. Only one name came back: Michael Hoagland, a seasonal assistant from Juneau, who'd been at the camp 3 days before, but hadn't checked in for breakfast since. We hadn't really noticed, if I'm being honest. With the long shifts and staggered sleep cycles, you could go a day without seeing someone and not think much of it. We called his name, walked the line of trees, even tried to follow a faint indent in the moss that might have been a path, but it stopped dead after 15 feet. We searched until sunset, then we went back. There was no signal from his sat tag either. Like the collars, it had just ended. Same timestamp, 2:47 a.m. The next morning I went out alone. I don't know why. Maybe I felt guilty for not noticing sooner. Maybe I thought I'd missed something. About half a mile from the camp, I found one of the missing collars. It was half buried in a bed of leaves, perfectly clean, not damaged or torn. Just sitting there like someone had placed it gently on the ground. The tag ID matched a female from the herd we'd been tracking, one that had been moving steadily for weeks, showing no signs of illness or migration stress. I left it where I found it. When I got back, Dr. Ray told us the university was suspending operations until further review. We packed everything by noon and flew out the next day. No one ever found Michael. His file went into the state database as a presumed exposure disappearance, but there was no record of his beacon activating, no distress signal, no terrain markers. Just those boots, standing straight, waiting. I still think about that timestamp, not because of what we lost, but because of how it all stopped clean, synchronized, like someone hit a switch. And those figures, the way they moved, the silence they left behind. Whatever was out there didn't kill the herd. It removed them. I was never one to snoop into guests' business. You work long enough in a seasonal lodge, especially out in the middle of nowhere, and you learn pretty quick that privacy is part of the unspoken deal. But that week in October, something unfolded behind closed doors that didn't sit right. And what still bothers me is that it took days to see it for what it was. Not a storm or a fight or a drunk guest wandering off, but a slow unraveling of a lie, and maybe something worse underneath it. Back in 2014, I was 25 and working my third season at a wilderness lodge about 2 hours by Bush Plain, northwest of Fairbanks. It was the kind of place couples booked when they wanted to disconnect completely. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just pine cabins, bear-safe dumpsters, and a bathhouse with too many spider webs in the corners. I worked front desk and supply logs. We had 6 guest cabins, 2 seasonal staff cabins, and a main lodge with the kitchen, radio room, and bathhouse all under one roof. That week, we had only one reservation, a group of 3 in cabin 4. Their names were Troy, Amanda, and David. They were in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, and said they were friends from college doing a no phones allowed trip before winter locked everything down. Troy was the one who handled the booking. He was friendly joked with the pilot when they landed and asked if the lake froze hard enough to walk on. Amanda seemed tired, like she hadn't slept in a few days. David didn't say much at all, wore sunglasses indoors, smiled when spoken to but never volunteered anything. The first 2 days were quiet. They kept to themselves, went on long hikes during the day, and came back around dusk to eat and sit by the fire pit. I only saw them during check-ins for gear or weather reports, but I started noticing small things. The logbook in the lodge would show signs of someone flipping through it, pages slightly out of place, faint smudges like gloves that weren't quite dry. One night the keys for cabin 5 were out of order on the hook. That cabin was locked and unoccupied. On the 3rd evening, I was stocking towels near the bathhouse when I heard arguing. The voices were muffled at first, just one sharp reply, followed by a long silence. I moved quietly toward the door and stopped just short of the corner. Someone inside was crying, not loudly, just short, breathy gasps like they were trying hard not to be heard. Then Amanda's voice, too calm, too even, said, "He shouldn't have pushed him." The door opened a few seconds later. I stepped away before they saw me. David walked out, his shirt damp, and passed by without saying a word. Amanda came out after holding her arm like it hurt. She smiled when she saw me, said the water was perfect, and asked if we had any more herbal soap. I handed her a fresh bottle from the supply cart. Her hands shook when she took it. That night, Troy didn't come to dinner. Amanda said he'd caught a cold and was resting. David nodded and added something about altitude. I offered to bring soup to the cabin, but they declined, said he just needed sleep. The next morning, I noticed the towels from cabin 4 hadn't been returned. Normally, guests drop them in the bin outside the bathhouse. I knocked gently on their door around 10, but no one answered. Around noon, Amanda came up to the lodge to borrow snowshoes and asked if we could keep the generator running later that night. I said we could. She didn't mention Troy. I didn't ask. That evening, around 5, David came into the lodge alone. He looked different, not just tired, but worn down like he'd aged a year in a day. He asked if there was any way to contact someone about a missing person. I didn't react at first. I just stared at him. He repeated it. "Someone went missing," he said. "Last night. In the woods." That's when I called the troopers. The weather was turning by then, sleet falling sideways, visibility dropping fast. The closest ranger post said they'd try to get a chopper out at first light. They told us to stay put, take notes, and secure the remaining guests. I relayed that to Amanda and David. They both nodded. David said he'd show the rangers the last place he saw Troy. Amanda didn't speak. That night I sat by the radio and tried not to let my thoughts wander. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps outside the lodge. I assumed it was David, maybe heading to the bathhouse. I stepped out to say something and saw Amanda instead walking alone across the gravel path toward cabin 2. That cabin was locked. No one had used it in weeks. I watched as she stood there for a long moment, then leaned against the door like she was listening to something inside. After about a minute, she turned and walked away. The troopers arrived the next morning. Their flight was bumpy, but they made it in. They interviewed Amanda and David separately, then began searching the perimeter. They found Troy that afternoon. He was alive. He was lying face down in a drainage hollow about half a mile west of the cabins, his jacket soaked through. Fingers blue and ribs fractured. He was hypothermic and dehydrated, but he could speak. Barely. What he said made the troopers look twice at each other. He claimed David had pushed him. Not in a fight, not in anger. He said David had pushed him intentionally off a ledge near the trail behind the old lookout. He said Amanda had watched, didn't stop it, didn't speak. The medevac took Troy out that evening. Amanda and David were taken in for questioning. I didn't hear what happened next. The lodge closed for the season 2 days later, and by the time spring came back around, neither name was mentioned again in any of the staff briefings. But there were whispers. Someone said Amanda cooperated fully, said she confessed they'd planned to scare Troy as a twisted joke, a fake survival scenario to see how he'd react. But it went too far. Someone else said David didn't say anything at all. Just sat in the ranger office for 6 hours without blinking. What stays with me isn't the betrayal or the injuries or the legal outcome. It's that moment outside cabin 2. Amanda standing there in the dark, pressing her ear to the wood like she was listening for someone who was already gone. Maybe she thought she'd hear him. Maybe she hoped she wouldn't. Either way, the cabin was empty. And she stayed there far too long. I'd always wanted to work in the field, but I never expected to be afraid of the woods, especially not the kind of quiet fear that settles in slowly like mist along the tree line, barely noticeable until it's too thick to see through. That fall, I got exactly what I thought I wanted a job, with the state's wildlife monitoring team tracking caribou herds near the Alaska-Yukon border. It was the kind of work that meant long hours, unpredictable weather, and days without seeing another human. I loved it. Until the week the collars went dead. We were based near the foothills of the White Mountains, working out of a prefab station that had been flown in by cargo chopper the previous spring. Just 3 of us on site: Aaron, who ran point on the research, Mark, who handled data entry and drone work, and me, a field tech trained to follow GPS trails, set up cameras, and occasionally snowshoe into the scrub when a collar stopped moving. In October, it got quiet out there. The herds moved slower. The air stayed still, and the cold stopped feeling sharp and started feeling permanent. The trouble started on a Thursday morning right after breakfast. Erin was checking the live GPS feeds on her tablet when she froze. I watched her scroll back and forth through a cluster of red dots, each one a collar from a tagged caribou, and all of them, she said, had gone dark at once. 43 collars, not a gradual drop-off, not a random scatter. They all stopped transmitting between 2 to 41 and 2:46 a.m. At first, we assumed it was a technical issue, maybe a tower fault or a battery firmware glitch. Erin double-checked the servers. Everything was green. No system errors, no satellite lag, no power surges. Then she checked the last recorded positions. Every signal had vanished within the same 6-square-mile region, just east of the Bering Glacier drainage. No terrain obstructions, no reports of weather events, no logical reason why 43 caribou, along with all their tracking hardware, would just stop existing. Jamie, the pilot we worked with out of Fairbanks, flew us over the site that afternoon. From above, it looked ordinary, a wide stretch of brush, lightly dusted in snow, cut by a few shallow creeks, and bordered by sparse pine. We scanned the area for an hour. Nothing moved. We didn't see so much as a set of antlers. Erin decided we'd send in drones the next morning for thermal imaging. That night, we barely spoke. I tried reading a paperback I'd brought from home, but I kept glancing at the time. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard the wind kick up. Just a low moan against the siding, nothing violent. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't sleep until the sky started turning gray. The next day, Mark launched 2 drones just after sunrise. One with standard video, one with thermal sensors. The plan was to grid the area and review footage that evening. He handed Erin a flash drive after dinner, and she took it into the radio room where we had the better monitor. I joined her a few minutes later. Mark stayed behind to finish syncing the weather logs. At first, the footage looked normal. Long stretches of quiet trees, low hills, and empty sky. Then the thermal pass started. Erin slowed the playback manually frame by frame. She leaned forward, squinting. 7 heat signatures. They weren't caribou. Too tall, too upright, and too synchronized. They moved in a line, not straight but arcing like a ripple in fabric. No variation in gait, no hesitation, just motion. All 7 glided across the screen and disappeared behind a ridge. Erin didn't say anything. She just rewound it and played it again. I asked her what she thought it was. She said she didn't know. That night, Mark didn't come to dinner. His gear was gone from the cot when we checked. We found the door to the Eastern Trail shack unlatched. Erin left a note on the comms log and called it in to Dr. Grant back at base, but radio conditions were spotty, and we couldn't get a stable response. We figured maybe Mark had gone out early to set a camera trap. It wasn't unheard of. He'd done it before, without warning. The next morning, Jamie flew in again earlier than planned. Erin had gotten through to base just long enough to report a missing person, and protocol required a sweep. We guided him to the GPS point where Mark's tablet had last pinged. Jamie dropped us off and circled overhead while we hiked out. It didn't take long to find the spot. A small clearing, mostly frozen brush, surrounded by a horseshoe of pine. No footprints, no animal sign, just a pair of boots side by side, sitting at the edge of a shallow creek. Not tossed, not trampled, just placed, as if someone had taken them off carefully and stepped away. But there were no steps beyond them. No marks in the frost, no scuff in the moss, just silence. We searched until sunset. The boots were flown back as evidence. Mark was listed as missing, presumed lost in the field. Erin didn't say much after that. She kept to herself, checked the GPS feeds twice a day, and logged everything even when there was nothing to log. 3 days later, one of the callers came back online. Not moving, just broadcasting from the same 6-square-mile region. I volunteered to retrieve it. It took me 5 hours to get there. I followed the coordinates exactly. The tag was buried, not just dropped, but dug into the frozen dirt about 10 inches down. Clean, no blood, no fur. Just the tag, the same serial number etched on the side, transmitting from inside the earth. I radioed Erin, bagged the collar, and left as fast as my legs would carry me. That was my last week on the job. I didn't renew for winter season. Sometimes I wonder if it was just data failure. If what we saw on the thermal footage was a trick of heat bloom or sensor error. But I still remember how Erin stood in the cold that last morning, watching the tree line while I packed up my gear. She said, "They move like they already know where you'll be." She never explained what she meant, and I didn't ask. I spent one winter working at a lodge near the Wrangell Mountains. It wasn't a resort, more like a backcountry retreat. For off-grid vacationers who didn't mind hauling water or splitting their own wood. My job was simple: shovel snow, keep the generator running, and unlock the bathhouse in the morning. We only had 5 cabins spaced far enough apart that you rarely saw another soul unless you were looking for them. I liked the silence, but that winter one guest didn't check out, and the others never really explained why. It was late February when they arrived, 3 of them all traveling together, 2 men and a woman. They checked in just before sunset, the woman doing most of the talking. Her name was Amanda, early 30s, brown parka, soft voice that carried further than you'd expect. The others were David and Troy, maybe mid to late 30s. David had the kind of energy you learn to avoid: sharp smile, loud, always trying to turn every moment into a performance. Troy was quieter. He didn't say much during check-in, just signed the logbook and followed the others out toward cabin 4. By the second day, I noticed something was off. They didn't go out hiking like most of our guests did. Instead, they stayed close to the cabin. I saw them once at the firewood stack, David splitting kindling, while Amanda stood nearby, arms crossed. Troy was sitting on the steps, staring out at the tree line like he was watching for something. No one looked at each other when I passed. Just 3 people sharing space without speaking. On the 3rd night, around 9 p.m., I went out to lock the tool shed and noticed the bathhouse light still on. Guests were supposed to close up behind them, but it wasn't unusual for someone to forget. I walked over to switch it off, and as I opened the door, I caught movement behind the frosted glass of the shower stall. I called out standard protocol. The figure didn't answer, just stood there, still. No steam, no running water. I backed out slowly and left the light on, figuring someone wanted privacy, and forgot to hang the in-use sign. But something about the way that silhouette stood, arms stiff at their sides, stuck with me all the way back to my cabin. The next morning, I got up early to salt the path. Cabin 4's door was open. I didn't think much of it until Amanda came walking down the hill toward me, coat unzipped despite the cold, face pale like she hadn't slept. She asked if anyone had reported seeing Troy, said he hadn't come back after going to the bathhouse the night before. I told her I hadn't seen him. I radioed the lodge manager, but the signal was patchy. Amanda and David stood off to the side while I explained the situation. David lit a cigarette, and when Amanda shot him a look, he said, "Maybe he just needed a walk." She didn't reply. We waited until noon, then checked the bathhouse together. It was empty. The snow around it had been disturbed, but not in a clear direction, just a lot of tracks going in circles like someone pacing. No fresh trail heading into the woods, no sign of a struggle. His boots were still inside. I asked Amanda if Troy had taken a coat. She said no. Said he hated the cold. David seemed less concerned. When I asked if they'd had an argument, he just shrugged and said, "Not more than usual." I noted the phrasing. Amanda didn't correct him. The next day, I got a radio call. They'd sent in a ranger from a nearby station. He showed up mid-afternoon, checked the area, interviewed Amanda and David. They gave similar stories. Troy had gone to shower and never came back. No one had heard anything. The ranger took down notes, promised a follow-up, and said the wind likely erased any trail. But he didn't look convinced. That night, Amanda came to my door. She looked shaken and asked if I had spare candles. When I handed her a couple, she said something strange. He knocked before he left. That's the part I can't explain. I asked what she meant. She said, "He always did that, this little rhythm 3 quick knocks. He did it last night." I opened the door. No one was there. I wanted to say it was probably wind or the lodge creaking, but she wasn't asking for comfort. She just needed to say it out loud. 3 days passed with no news. Then they found him. He was alive, barely. A pilot spotted him moving near a frozen creek 10 miles west. No coat, frostbite, lacerations down his arms. They medevaced him out. Amanda and David left that night. No goodbyes. Weeks later, I got a call from a trooper who was following up. Said Troy had talked just enough to press charges. Said David had attacked him. Amanda had helped cover it up. They'd fought in the cabin. Over something old, something personal. David pushed Troy. Troy hit his head. They thought he was dead. They dumped him behind the bathhouse, figured the cold would finish what they started. But Troy woke up, crawled away before sunrise. Amanda turned herself in. She told the full story, but the trooper said there were parts she left out, especially the bit about the knocking. I told him what she said to me, and he got real quiet on the other end of the line. "You're not the first person to mention knocks," he said. And then he asked me something I still don't understand. He said, "That rhythm 3 quick knocks. You ever heard it somewhere else, Daniel?" I said, "No. But I've thought about it ever since, because a few nights after they left, I woke up around 2:40 a.m., and from the far end of the cabin by the wood stove, I heard it. 3 soft, fast knocks. Then silence. No footsteps, no wind, just that rhythm. And no one at the door. I don't know if the story matters now, but I keep thinking about it when I can't sleep, especially on nights when the wind rattles the windows and the house seems a little too quiet. It happened in Nebraska, far from anything familiar. I'd been sent to evaluate a pair of aging bridges outside a township called Nyman Hollow. Just a few gravel roads, a diner, and a post office that had been closed since 1993. The town didn't show up on most maps anymore, and the only reason I knew I was in the right place was a hand-painted sign someone had nailed to a dying elm tree. I got there mid-afternoon in early November, sky the color of unpolished steel, and the air already cold enough that my breath fogged up the windshield. There were no hotels, just a listing in the contract packet that said room included C. Sylvia, at the Hollow Diner. I found the diner with no trouble. It stood at the bend of a low road, its windows flickering with soft yellow light. Sylvia greeted me like she'd been expecting me her whole life, handed me a metal key on a plastic tag labeled Room 3, and pointed me around back to a 2-story add-on that looked like it used to be a barn. The room was clean enough. No TV, but the radiator worked. That night I had dinner in the main room of the diner, one of those U-shaped counters with red stools and booths pressed against the walls. Sylvia cooked. I was the only customer until a man in a gray coat came in just after 800. He didn't speak when he entered, didn't even nod. He sat in the booth directly across from mine, though the rest of the diner was empty. I tried not to stare, but I kept catching myself glancing up. His coat was too thin for the weather, and the way he sat very still, eyes half closed like he was waiting for something, made my skin tighten. Sylvia brought him a cup of coffee without asking, and set it down gently like she didn't want to wake him. But he wasn't asleep. I could feel his eyes on me even when I didn't look. When I left for the night, I gave him a nod. He didn't return it, just stared at the wall behind me like something was moving on it. The next morning, Wade, the county liaison, picked me up in a rusted truck. He drove me out to the first bridge, told me about flood risks, explained which farmers used which routes. He was pleasant enough, but he said something strange when I mentioned the diner. I told him about the man in the gray coat, and he gave me this tight, unreadable look. "Don't sit in that booth again," he said. "You're in town on contract. That's fine. But don't invite things you don't understand." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He didn't laugh back. That evening I went to the diner again, this time sitting closer to the window. Sylvia served me meatloaf and mashed potatoes, asked about the bridges, and didn't mention the man. I didn't either. But just after 8 huzras, the bell above the door jingled, and he returned. Same coat, same expression, same booth. He didn't eat, just sipped from the same coffee cup I'd seen the night before. I tried not to look at him, but something about the way he held the mug was wrong. It wasn't the grip or the angle. It was the stillness, like the coffee had become part of him. Or he'd forgotten what it was for. That night back in room 3, I couldn't sleep. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard 3 slow knocks on the outside wall behind the radiator. Not the door, not the window, the wall. Like someone standing in the dark, knowing I was just on the other side of it. I didn't move. The radiator kept clanking. No footsteps followed, nothing more. Just those 3 knocks and the sound of something waiting. The next day, Wade canceled the site visit, said a truck jackknifed on one of the county roads. I had the afternoon free. Against my better judgment, I walked the length of Nyman Hollow, if you could call it that. A schoolhouse with no roof. A post office filled with leaves. and one house freshly painted curtains, drawn with a gray coat folded neatly on the porch rail. No one was inside, but I felt watched the whole time. That evening was my last. I planned to leave early in the morning. I debated skipping dinner entirely, but convinced myself I was being paranoid. I went back to the diner. Only Sylvia was there. No man in the gray coat. I asked about him. Sylvia looked at me too long, then said quietly, "We don't talk about him after the third night. That's when the pattern starts. You've only seen him twice. Best not to ask a third time." I wanted to argue. I wanted to laugh, but my mouth was too dry. I thanked her and left before 800. I never checked out the next morning, just left the key on the counter and drove south until the sky turned gold again. I don't know what the man was. I don't know what happens on the third night. But once or twice a year I wake up at 2:30 a.m., heart pounding, sure I've heard those 3 knocks. Always slow, always precise, and always on a wall that shouldn't have anyone behind it. That's the last one I'll share tonight. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a rhythm to the stories, an odd sort of echo. A stranger who stares too long, a knock that doesn't come from a door, a sound in the dark that doesn't want to explain itself. The places shift: mountains, highways, snowy roads, forgotten towns, but the feeling stays the same. That sensation that something is just out of view, watching, waiting, remembering that you passed by. I think we try to explain these things because silence is harder to live with. But sometimes the story isn't there to be solved. It's just there to be told, to be remembered. And maybe that's enough. I've come to believe that unease is part of being human. It rises in places where the rules fray a little, when it's too quiet or too dark or too familiar in ways you can't put your finger on. These stories don't have endings because the feeling doesn't end. It lingers tucked into corners of memory like dust in an attic you rarely visit but never forget. And tonight, maybe something in one of these stories has found its own corner in you. I hope it whispers quietly. I hope it lets you sleep. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories lingered with you even just a little, I'd love for you to follow the channel, share this with someone who enjoys a quiet chill, and subscribe for more nights like this. And tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere that felt just slightly off? Even if nothing ever happened, I'd like to know. Sleep well.